Assuming that you're faithfully following the Developer University curriculum, you may recall from the C# Fundamentals via ASP.NET web application course, I believe it was video topic number 68, where we introduced Bootstrap. And we were able to apply great typography and some resizing, some responsive resizing functionality merely by including a reference and then adding a few classes to our HTML. And in that lesson at the time, I said we're only scratching the surface. Bootstrap offers a lot more. We'll talk about it in its own course. And here we are in that course. And so you'll probably recall from that initial exposure that Bootstrap is an open source CSS framework from the folks at Twitter. So it's used at Twitter and thousands of other large websites and projects. And it's certainly not the only CSS framework that's available. I did a quick search for the term popular CSS frameworks in 2016 and came up with this little web page. You can search for that exact phrase and find the web page that I'm at currently right now. And frankly, there's about 19 of these frameworks that I've never heard of before. I'm sure they have specific niches or they have particular strengths. Maybe some weaknesses. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap. However, I'm not creating courses about any of these except for one of them, which is obviously Twitter Bootstrap. And the reason I'm not covering any of the rest of them is because Microsoft has seemed to pick Twitter Bootstrap as its de facto CSS framework. And you see that evident in the project templates whenever you go to create a new ASP.NET web application, whether web forms or MVC. And for that reason, I decided to add it as part of the core curriculum to Developer University. Actually, it's not part of the core curriculum. It's an optional component of the curriculum. Optional, why? Because frankly, I think that based on what you already know about Bootstrap and the fact that you've already worked with HTML and CSS a little bit up to this point, and given the fact that there is great documentation with lots of examples out there, you could probably figure out everything that you ever need to know about Bootstrap without my help at all, without any videos. You can, again, look through the Getting Started guide, the CSS reference, and even look at the components, and you can probably piece together anything that you ever need to do. However, I wanted to cover Bootstrap 4 because I promised I would, and because it is such an important topic. You might choose to use this course as merely reference. At some point, this course is going to be me saying, hey, here's a feature of Bootstrap, and let's apply it to this HTML, and wow, look at what that did. So I think when we get to that point in the course that it's going to be less rewarding. However, up front, you might find some of the introductory material, how to install and use the alpha version of Bootstrap 4 as it's in its current state as I record this course, and then how to at least some thought process and some workflows regarding Bootstrap 4 that might not be so obvious at first glance. So I'm going to let you decide whether you treat this course as pure reference or as part of your core curriculum in your study. As you'll recall, Bootstrap's main claim to fame is this responsive grid system that hides a lot of the complexity around viewports and media queries whenever you want to create a mobile-first responsive application. So in other words, if we were to resize this page, you can see that we lose our typical navigation bar, but we gain the hamburger style navigation. And although it's not quite as evident on most of this page, you can see that instead of these columns being all lined up in a row, now they're all lined up and stacked vertically on top of each other. If we were to pull the size of this out, you can see that this now pops back into place, and each of those little columns are next to each other in a row. So that's really the main claim to fame, to provide the responsiveness of using one code base and being able to accommodate smaller and larger form factors. But it also features default typography, and you can see that at work here on this particular page. And you can see how we get some sans serif fonts and font sizes by default without any extra work. In addition to that, we can resize fonts responsively based on the current media query. We also get default formatting for our form fields. Now this looks dramatically different because they've simplified form fields, and we can apply a more 3.0 look and feel like you see in this example here with the sign-in page, the rounded corners, the big blue buttons, and you can see what they did here was just basically add their own classes with some rounding and things of that nature. So we'll talk about the differences in how forms are actually handled, but you get a lot of features and functions from a typography standpoint for free with Bootstrap. Furthermore, there are classes that are included out of the box that will allow you to modify the behavior of individual cells in your layout based on the current media query. So we can show and hide things based on whether we're in a smaller or a larger form factor. And then finally, there are higher level components that usually require several HTML tags as well as proper classes for those tags in order to accomplish. So a good example of this would be the carousel, which allows you to have a timed set of images that just rotate, or you can force it by clicking a little edge area on either side or the little navigation area at the bottom. And you can see all the HTML that it required to do that, as well as the classes in each of those HTML tags. And the point of this is that you get a lot of these utility features, anywhere from simple things like jumbotrons to larger and more advanced things like nav bars, breadcrumb navigation, progress bars, all again part of Bootstrap. And so we're going to talk about most of these components throughout this course, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. As I record this, let's go back here to this page. You can see that at the very top, there's this blue bar that says, oh yeah, Bootstrap 4 is coming. And so Bootstrap 4, as I record this course, is currently in alpha, which means that it's under active development. It's under active review, and bugs and bug reports are being filed, that there's discussions about features that will be included and so on. And so the development team is currently working on it. You can watch the development team in a very public way out on GitHub if you want. And while there are certainly some important changes that are coming from what I understand between 4 and 3, fortunately, version 4, as it stands right now, is similar enough to version 3 that I can confidently talk about it. In other words, almost everything that you learn in version 3 will be applicable to version 4. Only in a few cases did they actually eliminate features or change how they actually worked. In most cases, features were merely being added or enhanced. Also, Bootstrap 4 will continue to work on all newer web browsers, with a caveat. Bootstrap 4 is dropping support for Internet Explorer 8. So if you need that support, you're going to need to stay with Bootstrap 3. Furthermore, we're going to learn about optional features in this course, like the Flexbox feature, which use features in CSS3 that are not supported by older versions of browsers. Therefore, if you choose to use that optional feature of Bootstrap, then you're going to eliminate other web browsers. Unfortunately, browsers like Internet Explorer 9 and Internet Explorer 10. So we'll talk about that later, but just know that this may have some impact on the browsers that you can target with your web application. Whenever you're using any newer feature of CSS or HTML or even JavaScript, I highly recommend that you take a look at caniuse.com, and you can see I've already typed in the word Flexbox here. What you can typically do is type some feature like, let's just say rounded corners, and it'll show you the versions of each vendor's browser that support that given feature of CSS or HTML or JavaScript, as well as any known issues and how you can work your way around them. So caniuse.com should be bookmarked if you're doing any front-end work on an ongoing basis. All right, so in the next few lessons, we're going to install Bootstrap 4, the alpha version, the preview, in Visual Studio, since we'll work in that environment. We'll talk about the other ways that you can utilize it, like accessing it from a CDN. What are some of the issues surrounding that? We'll talk about some controversy around Bootstrap and CSS frameworks in general, and what you need to know in order to talk to people who resist the use of Bootstrap, and why you should go ahead and learn Bootstrap regardless, because after all, it's being used by so many web projects. And after we cover some of that conceptual material regarding Bootstrap 4, we'll move on and actually start implementing code, writing code, using the classes in Bootstrap, or even modifying Bootstrap and using it in our application. So this is going to be exciting. Hang in there with me, and let's get started in the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks.